Hello and welcome to another Shift Remote. This is the 8th in our 12-part series of virtual conferences where we bring together the brightest developers online for you, our wonderful audience. Now, we've had 7 incredible conferences so far and we're near the end. We've only got 4 more to go, but it's been exciting and it's great to be back in this virtual space. For those of you for whom this is new, thank you for joining us. For those of you that you're used to this by now, welcome back for another Shift conference. My name is Bilal Harry Khan and I'm going to be your host for this conference, which means that I'll be popping up in between speakers to introduce the next in our incredible lineup. Now today we have 7 speakers ready to talk to us and share their wisdom and their knowledge and experience in the field. And it's going to be about 2.5 hours that we've got together. Around the hour and a half mark, we'll take a bit of a break where you get some chance to get some fresh air away from your screens. But I do ask that whilst you're here, you stay here for the energy and you bring that energy using the chat. Now, I know it's not the same as being in a room, but we're going to go to the chat and just give me a hello in whatever your native language is. Get ready. I'm going to ask if you're excited. I'm going to assume you're going to type yes, because you will be. Because our conference is always an exciting one and it's great to be back in this space with you. Now, before we get to our speakers, it wouldn't be a conference without our incredible supporters behind the scenes. So I want to take a couple moments to say a huge thank you to the teams at Microsoft Infobip, Raiffeisen Bank, also the teams at Autodesk, Microblink, Barrage, Azure Idea, ICT Japan, Your Venture, Pseudocode 5, Ars Futura, Nanobit, Infinuum and Q. We've also got 9 Dots, Get by Bus, Aspira and Code Anywhere and Pluggy. Without you, none of this would be possible. Please do engage with the conference online. Use the hashtag ShiftRemote for any photos that you do want to take and put up for us. Now, without further ado, with my hellos and thank yous out of the way, I'm going to pass over to the man behind this all, CEO and founder of Shift Conference, Ivan Burazin.
Hello everyone and welcome back to a new episode of Shift Remote. We haven't been with you for a while, but that's because we've been busy. We've had our in-person developer conference last week in the open-air sunny city of Split, Croatia. Hope some of you that attended the event are now here with us as well and will be with us throughout the next couple of months as we wrap up this series of Shift Developer Remote. Anyway, since today's topic is game dev, one of my favorite topics, we have some amazing speakers from Google, from Xbox Studios, and from Nanobit. For those of you who don't know, Nanobit is now super famous. They got acquired for $148 million, euros. Don't know, a lot of money. Anyway, great speakers from there. So I hope you enjoy the show and tune in later this week as well for our next episode. Enjoy it, have fun, talk to you soon. Later.
Thank you, Ivan. Now, moving into our conference, our first speaker is a game developer at 343 Industries, designing and creating exciting new multiplayer experiences for the upcoming Halo Infinite. He was born and raised in Mexico City and has done some incredible work advocating for the Latinx community and the democratization of gaming. Let me introduce to you Fernando Reyes Medina.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in for my talk Designing Inside the Box, where we will be talking about the importance of constraints in creative projects and how we can really embrace those constraints to innovate. First, a little bit about me. My name is Fernando Reyes Medina. I am a game designer working at 343 Industries in Microsoft. I am originally from Mexico City, but now I'm living in Seattle in the US. For those who are not familiar with 343, we are responsible for the Halo franchise, and I am currently working on the multiplayer suite of experiences of Halo Infinite. Like many other game creators, from a very young age, I dream of creating unique, innovative games. Games that challenge our preconception of what a game is, or unique experiences that the world has never seen before. Given that games are the perfect blend of art and technology, a lot of the skills that I have developed as a game designer in my career have been around these two domains. However, I believe that the most important skill that I am constantly working as a creator is figuring out the best way of working within constraints. The reality of any creative piece of content is that there are limits of what can be achieved for that specific project. From a production standpoint, you have a limited budget that allows a team to work on that particular project for a set amount of time. In terms of the team, each team member has different areas of expertise, and oftentimes the project that can be created reflects the team composition and the strengths of the team. And finally, your time is not only constrained by how long you can afford to pay your team, but also other deadlines or events can limit the flexibility of this time, like releasing your project in time for the holidays, or if a similar product is scheduled to release at the same time as your project. The goals of a project can also act as constraints. Having the right prioritization of goals can help a project to be more successful, and often changes the way innovation is approached. For example, in my industry, all games are supposed to be successful, but success is measured differently depending on what the goals are. Is the game supposed to be critically acclaimed? Is it a financial success? Or is it creatively fulfilling for the team? Ideally, you would hit all of them, but sometimes compromises have to be made depending on the priorities of the project. I think another important lesson I've learned in my career is that my definition of what a game designer does has evolved, and this has changed how I approach creativity and innovation in my games. I think it's a very common misunderstanding to see game designers as idea generators. And while sometimes we get to do some of that, in an ideal and a healthy team, everyone, regardless of discipline, should be encouraged to give ideas to make the best game possible. So I think that rather than being an idea generator, I think game designers are actually problem solvers. In order to explain how this connects with the topic we're discussing today, I want to share you a little example of what my day-to-day looks like in a non-game development world. So let's say that we're given the task of designing a single passenger vehicle that is fun to ride. In our brainstorming session, we start with any constraints, right? So our mind immediately jumps into something like this. A motorcycle that can go fast, because fast is fun, right? And can have a beautiful chassis design. Maybe we can make it electric to be environmentally friendly and market this as a high-end product. So we're very excited about our design. We present this to the project leaders. But then we learn that the cost of R&D for an electric engine is way above the budget that this project in particular has. Actually, having an engine is not possible at all because we also have a price point to hit. So we need to reduce manufacturing costs as possible. Finally, the target audience should be as broad as possible. So that's another reason why having a motorized vehicle would not work for this product. With that information in mind, we go back to the drawing board, and we as designers come back with a product that fits the requirements established. A bicycle does not require an engine to work. In fact, thanks to this requirement, we can sell this as a fitness product as much as a transportation device. It requires less parts to make it, so it will be cheaper to produce and will have a lower price point. And we can still get some pretty design on the frame and a cool paint over to make it look pretty. So we're very excited about our current solution, and we started manufacturing of it. But then the production realities start kicking in. The team that is responsible for making the handlebar cannot deliver the handles at a quality bar that is acceptable for our brand. And we can't extend the release date because we will miss the holiday season. Also, we realize the manufacturer of wheels is having a shortage of rubber and will not be able to fulfill the number of wheels we require in order to ship enough units as we're expecting, so we can recover the financial investment in the project. As a designer, this is one of the hardest moments that you face, when the box is so restrictive that it's almost impossible to see what the solution could be. But in the end, you figure it out. You come up with a solution that fits the initial constraints and also the additional emerging ones that you face along the ride. And what happens is that usually this product ends up being very creative and presents a unique solution to the design challenge that we had in front of us. And it's a solution that you would not have arrived if it wasn't for these constraints. These two products deliver the goal initially established, but one is grounded in reality, and one can be and one can be achieved while the other cannot be, no matter how awesome it sounds. And I know this example might sound ridiculous or exaggerated, but a lot of the most beloved and creative games out there have faced similar challenges in their development process. And here are some examples of that. Mario is probably one of the most, if not the most famous character in the video games industry. When Shigeru Miyamoto was designing its visual look in 1985, he had the challenge of having to design the character in a grid of 16 by 16 to fit within the memory limits of the hardware. Mario looks the way he looks nowadays thanks to these technical limitations presented at that time. Another example I really like is Silent Hill. Silent Hill is a horror game from 1999 created for the first PlayStation console. Given the rendering limitations of the platform at the time, the team had to use fog to hide the rendering popping effect shown in this video. But they decided to really embrace the limitations and use this fog as a narrative device in their game. It influenced everything from sound effects to the encounter design of enemies, creating an iconic aesthetic and terrifying gameplay that we all know from the franchise today. Finally, we have the example of Metal Gear Solid. Inspired by the action movies from the 80s, Hideo Kojima was given the task to create an action game for the MSX2 in 1985. The platform only allowed very few sprites on one screen at a time, so this presented some challenges to make a shooter action game. So what he decided to do was to work within these limitations and came up with a design for a combat game without combat. The tension of the game came from infiltration and avoiding enemies rather than trying to shoot them. This clever solution created a completely new game genre, the stealth action games. And I think that this is why innovation is not just coming up with new ideas. Innovation is about reimagining current solutions that are not feasible and turning them into something viable. Innovation requires results and new ways of solving a problem, instead of just something that sounds like a good idea. And it requires a lot of iteration. When we talk about innovation or creativity, the phrase think outside the box comes into play very often. The origin of this phrase is not very easy to track, but one of the things that made it very popular was this puzzle that we have on screen. Connect the dots with 4 straight lines without lifting the pen. The most common first reaction of anyone when they are presented this puzzle is to try to draw a box, which will not lead to the right answer. Instead, in order to solve this, we need to draw outside the boundaries of the dot arrangement in order to complete the requested task. What I find really ironic about this being the flagship example of thinking outside the box is that the uniqueness of the presented solution exists thanks to the constraints enforced by the initial puzzle prompt. If we could break any of these rules, the puzzle would be easy to solve, and we're not really moving the needle forward in terms of finding unique solutions for this very challenging problem, which is where I believe innovation lives. Solving problems outside the box sometimes can be a way to avoid the challenges in front of us, spending time on a solution that will not be feasible and it will never exist. Thinking inside the box is good. As uncomfortable as it is, it can bring real results that lead to real innovation in whatever field we're working on. As game designers, we're forced by many external factors to work within the realm of what is possible. And I think we should embrace that. We should try to explore everything within that box, since there are a lot of cool games to be discovered there. There are incredible, unique games that can be created inside the boundaries of reality. And I believe that all of that starts with painting the right box. The first thing to understand is what are the goals of your team, both as an organization and as individuals. Because I think this will inform the goals of the project and how these goals can be working in harmony and how they can have an impact beyond the completion of this particular project. Next, I think it's important to see the opportunities that are currently available but more importantly, the opportunities that will open in the future when the project is expected to be completed. And finally, the available resources will ground the project into reality to further clarify what is achievable. The team should be then able to fill in the box inside and explore every single corner of that. This is why I think it's very important to differentiate the way constraints work within a team and enforce them in an effective manner. Resources will be constrained, but we shouldn't constrain the way they are used. There are interesting and clever ways of using resources, and we should always keep an open mind to that. Same thing is true for the solutions. While the box for the goal should be well defined, the team should be able to explore freely and align to conclusions that fit these requirements, which leads to my next point. Innovation requires a collaborative environment where everyone is free to present ideas and solutions safely, and the team composition allows for diverse perspectives. While there are many ways to execute on designing inside the box, I find this particular thinking method very useful when talking about creativity in the products that we create. It's called systematic inventive thinking. It's developed in Israel in the 90s, and it's actually derived from a formula called trees created by Gendrik Altschuler in 1946. He analyzed over 20,000 patents searching for patterns in innovation, and then he grouped all these patterns into 40 inventive principles that any innovative product falls into. SIT takes this idea and tries to simplify it into 5 thinking tools so it is easier to remember and apply. The first step to apply SIT to a product is defining a closed world, or our problem space, which involves the components of your product that are going to act as the building blocks for the unique solution. Then, as I mentioned before, SIT uses 5 thinking tools to be used as lenses on how to improve or create a new product from our defined closed world. The first one is abstraction. Can you remove something from the system? A lot of the most innovative products in the world have came from this approach. A good example of this is our previous exercise of the unicycle, right? Like derived from the parts of a bicycle. Next, we have multiplication. Is there any component that adding more of it will make it better? Televisions have been following this model to continue innovating all the time, using pixel count as a way of moving forward the technology. Next, we have division. Can we divide the building blocks of our problem world and rearrange them in a different way or create different products? A tablet is a great example of that. By getting rid of the keyboard of a laptop, we have created a completely new category of electronics. Next, we have attribute dependency. Can we remove or alter any of the properties of our existing components? Or maybe we can add additional dependencies that didn't exist before. A good example of this are transition sunglasses, the ones that darken as the light brightens when you go outside a building. Finally, we have task unification. Can we assign more than one task to an existing component? The best example I can think of is a smart speaker that can both play sounds or music and also listen to your voice and do other commands with that. I think there are many schools of thought on how to develop creative solutions, but I hope that this talk gives you a different perspective on the challenges that we face as creators and empowers you to stop worrying about the constraints that your project has and instead use those constraints to create a better product, or in the case of us game designers, a better game. If you have any thoughts or questions about this topic or are interested in knowing more about constraint creativity, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or by email. Thank you so much for watching my talk, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Fernando. Now, if you loved what Fernando had to say, let us know what bits of it you loved. Ask some questions, throw some stuff at us there in the chat. We love to hear from you at Shift Remote. Now, our next speaker is what I'm going to call a veteran. They are an outspoken, multi-award-winning advocate of the gaming industry, as well as a current executive director of the Global Game Jam. They're the former executive director of the International Game Developers Association and has been quoted numerous times. I'm delighted to introduce to you Kate Edwards.
Okay. Hi there, my name is Kate Edwards. I am the Executive Director of the Global Game Jam, but I'm also a geographer who has worked in the game industry for over 27 years now, doing what I call game culturalization. So in this very short time I have this today, I'm going to give you a little bit of a overview of what that looks like. How can you build better game worlds when you think about culturalization? Now, the worlds that we create, they're huge worlds. Some of them, most of them are big. Some of them are small. This depends. Like Skyrim here, incredible amount of detail, a lot of effort that went into this game. Games like Halo that take place in our real universe, as opposed to Skyrim, which is completely fictional, but this one takes place in the far future. Even games like Grand Theft Auto 5, which are very realistic and they seem to take place in our world, but this is what I would call hyperreal, because this is not Los Angeles. This is a version of Los Angeles called Los Santos that is meant to basically emulate LA, but is not LA. And of course, there's games like Assassin's Creed, where they take a fictional narrative and they overlay that on top of a very real place, such as, Renaissance Venice. In Minecraft, of course, this whole game is about world building. That's essentially what you do in this game. And so you learn about resource management and the creation of objects and the destruction of objects and all sorts of other things. A lot of people don't also think about the fact that a lot of world building goes into even mobile games like Angry Birds. There's a whole narrative here. There's a whole structure here that is behind this game, even though the gameplay is very simple, where you just, pull your finger and slingshot the birds towards the pigs. But there is a whole mechanic behind this. There's a lot of thinking that goes into the depth of this world, which maybe it wasn't all explored in this game, but in some cases, like with Rovio, they explored it in all kinds of other media. So what I'm getting at with culturalization is this idea that, the games that we create have a vast multicultural audience out there that they get exposed to. So you can see here from this recent data in 2020, there are a lot of gamers outside there, out in the world, and a lot of the growth is happening in areas which is typically not where a lot of developers that I meet, especially in North America and Europe, they tend to make their games for their markets. Like they'll say, I'm making this game for the United States, or I'm making this game for Germany. But then all the other markets out there in the world where a lot of the real growth is happening is an afterthought, which is kind of strange. So you can see even in this chart, the North American growth in the number of gamers actually declined a little bit from last year, where you're seeing this tremendous growth, especially in Asia, where of course China is now the largest gaming market in the world. So there's a tremendous amount of growth happening in a lot of markets out there, like Nigeria, 20%, India is like 17% year-over-year growth. So the amount of growth in a lot of these emerging markets is tremendous. And yet a lot of developers I meet do not make their games for these markets. They're not thinking about where the growth is happening. So it's that's one of the things to keep in mind, why culturalization can be really helpful, because it can adapt your content to these other markets. Now, what's the difference between localization and culturalization? I think a lot of us know what localization is. I mean, for the most part, this is about language translation. So you're trying to make sure that the text within your game is adaptable to different languages around the world, which is obviously extremely important. And that's always going to be important. But culturalization takes it to another level, where it's not just about the language and about translation. It's actually making sure that all the other elements within the content are going to be compatible with that local market. And that could be all kinds of things, from the use of symbols, color, gestures, character design, the use of history and religion, all these other factors that a lot of times, at least in my experience, a lot of game developers don't think about those things as much as they probably should. But there's been a trend over the last, I would say, decade or so that has accelerated, where a lot of companies are now thinking about this because they know it's important in order to, basically distribute their games into other markets. So basically what I'm trying to do in my role is to take the game worlds that are being created and see how can I make them adaptable and basically fit within the local worldview of the different markets into which they will be sold. And so this is kind of like a gene splicing exercise where my goal is to have culturalized content as the output. And the tricky part is navigating this space in the middle, where I'm constantly checking the content assets to see what is compatible and what's not compatible with the local market and what their expectations might be. And so that's really what culturalization is about, is trying to anticipate what those local expectations are and then see if there's room within the creative vision of the game to adapt the game to those local worldviews, if that's a goal of the creative process. So there's multiple considerations to think about when we do this kind of work. First of all, the company values and goals. And so this doesn't matter if you're even a single person indie developer or if you're a massive AAA company. The values that you have and the ethics of what you do are really important. Because, for example, if you decided to have a game where you showed Taiwan as an independent country, that game will get instantly banned in China. And it may affect your business in China for many years to come. And so you decide, is that something I want to do because I think it's important for my creative vision? Or is it something I want to change because I feel like I want to take advantage of the Chinese market? There is no right or wrong answer there necessarily, but it's something you have to think about. The other thing, the context in which content is generated is very important, because the way we view the world, we all have different worldviews, we all have different biases. And so the way products get created in different markets carries with it a certain context, a cultural context. Also, the business strategy for the particular vertical, this especially applies to larger companies, pardon me, like Sony and Microsoft. They don't make just games, they make all kinds of other things too. So they have to think about how they position the games. Also, the market strategy for a specific location, such as China, or the market strategy for a specific game, such as World of Warcraft. And then, of course, there's always the changing geopolitical, cultural, and ethical factors, because the world is a very dynamic place, which is something I think 2020 has taught us very clearly, that things can change very fast, both on a political and cultural value scale. And this is one of those things I have to watch for when a game is being released, that what are the current conditions within that market? Is this something that they will accept now, as opposed to maybe a year or 5 years ago? And that's something that's really critical to think about. So there's some core aspects of world building I want to cover. I realize this is a very short talk. There's a lot more to talk about here. So this is a very high-level introduction. So first is setting the context. The other part is the complexity, the degree of realization that you're looking for. And then the third part is the intent. So how much content are you going to build into it based on the narrative intent of your creative vision? So the real world and fictional world, basically, it's not black and white. There's a huge zone between these two. Just like I illustrated earlier, like Grand Theft Auto is not the real world, but it feels like it. So it's very close to the real world, whereas something like Skyrim is completely fictional. And so it has nothing to do with our universe. That decision does matter in terms of culturalization, whether or not you're going to be reflecting things in your world that are actually exist in our world, or if they're complete new creations. The other part that I want to emphasize is that when I use the word realization, I'm not talking about realism. What I'm talking about is how much world do you actually need to build, or how much you have to realize. Realism is about, photorealism and making it look realistic. That's not what I'm talking about. So how do you know how much world to build? Well, basically, you take the narrative goals of your creative vision, and you take also the experience goals of what the player is going to do. So what is the story being told, and what is the player doing within the context of that story? And those two things will combined give you your realization goals. That helps you understand how much world do you need to build in order to realize your creative vision. And that needs to be your guiding light throughout all of the decisions that you will make around culturalization. So here's some essential tools I want to talk about. I don't have time to talk about all of these things, so I'm going to talk about just one of them. But creating cultural evidence, which is basically building out the cultures or the existence of cultures and evidence of cultures within your game. The other part is implying complex systems. There's a way of using what is called topology to actually imply a much bigger universe in your game without actually building the levels, just because you can kind of make a psychological or factual connection with something within the game in a really simple way that kind of expands the universe of your game without actually building like a whole playthrough that someone has to do. Logical consistency, which I'm actually going to talk about that one in a moment, and also building structure with thematic layers. Like, how do you actually create and build out the world? Where do you even start with that? So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over to logical consistency. What this is all about is the idea that logical rules have to exist in your universe for everything that happens in the universe. And so basically all the systems within your game world need to make sense for the game's intended narrative. And there should not be a conflict between the content assets you're creating and the narrative intent of the world. And so basically logical consistency is something that we in our world, in our daily lives, we experience this all the time. We know what gravity feels like. We know what weather systems are like. These are systems that exist in our natural environment, and we rely on those to understand kind of the reality of what we deal with every day. And the games are no different. Even if you're going to have a game set in a fantasy or sci-fi world with amazing technologies or magic or something, even those elements need to have some kind of logical consistency with the world. Like if you're a big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien, like Lord of the Rings, like I am, even though he had magic and all kinds of interesting stuff with the Lord of the Rings, they all still fell within a structure that was logical for the world that he created. So here's an example from a game called Cameo that I worked on years ago. And so Cameo takes place in a completely fictional universe, and yet you could see here on the side of the road there were these wooden crosses. Now, what the artist did was they put the wooden crosses there because they were meant to be grave markers. And the problem, though, is that in this universe, there's no Christianity because it's a completely fantasy fictional universe. So this is one of those cases where I challenged the artist and I asked them, what are these supposed to be? And they said, well, they're grave markers. And I said, well, why would it be a wooden cross? Because, they didn't really think this through. And it's a little bit of an example of lazy creativity because they just put a cross in there because, they just decided that that's what a grave marker is, but they weren't thinking about the fact that that symbol has no logical consistency within this universe. So it didn't make any sense. So they actually, had to change it and make a grave marker that would be appropriate for this particular universe. The other thing with thematic layers that's really important is that to think about all the different things that goes into building your game world. So some people might wonder, why is a geographer talking about this stuff and talking about game development? Well, part of the reason is because geographers, we are ideal because we spend all of our time world building and deconstructing the real world. That's what we do for a living. So we try and understand the world around us. And when you see a map is, cartography is basically about world rebuilding. We've taken all those elements out there in the world and we've reconstructed them into a map that's supposed to represent some aspect of the real world. And game development is really not that much different because when you view the real world as thematic layers, like we do in geography, so we use a thing called geographic information system to organize those layers, just like this diagram shows, so that we can have an understanding of phenomenon out there in the world and how those phenomenon relate to the place. In the same way, you can take that concept when you're building your world and think about all the different thematic layers that go into building your world. And this is just a sample of the kind of layers that you could use when building out your game. Now, the question is, what layers do you even start with? Well, of course, most of them have some kind of geophysical. There's a ground, there's gravity, there's things like that. So a lot of these are basic to a lot of games. But take something like climatology, so the weather system. For some games I've worked on, they spent a tremendous amount of time building out a complex weather system, and yet the weather system doesn't really have anything to do with the gameplay. It just kind of is there for atmospheric effects. Whereas if if you've played Breath of the Wild, the latest Zelda game, Breath of the Wild, the weather system has a direct impact on your gameplay. I mean, the lightning can hit you. It's harder to climb rocks because of the water if it's raining. All kinds of things happen depending on the weather. And so they really thought it through very carefully how the climatology system in a game like Breath of the Wild affects the gameplay. So that was core to the narrative. They needed a weather system because it really fit the open world nature of that game. Whereas other games, they may not need a weather system at all. They have no need for it. So you need to pick and choose which of these layers are relevant to your creative vision and to those realization goals that I mentioned earlier, which is the narrative and the user experience goals. And of course, this is a very simple list. You could go through this and break this out into many thousands of different layers. This is just very simplified for the sake of illustration. So in the last few minutes that I've got on this, I want to just talk about the most sensitive thematic layers that typically are a problem in games. And a lot of these are probably going to be obvious, like the use of real history or the use of faith. And I will explain all of these. So I'm just going to kind of dive right into this. So history, it can be really tricky because you're making a historical game. A lot of, cultures around the world, they have a different viewpoint on what their history really is. So I've worked on games like all the Age of Empires series and Rise of Nations and games like that. And we had to do a lot of work to understand what the local perspective is on their history. So this is an example from the first Age of Empires where what history tells us in all the history books is that the Japanese there on the right in blue, they invaded the Korean peninsula on the left and basically almost took over the Chosun Empire. This is way back in the Middle Ages. And that's what history says. And so that scenario was put into the game, but the Korean Ministry of Information, part of the government, said that never happened. So in order to release the game in Korea, we had to actually create a special patch only for Korean players that actually changed history. So you can see here that instead of Japan invading Korea, we had Korea invading Japan. Is this accurate? No, it isn't historically accurate. But then again, there's been a long history of tailoring content for specific markets when there is a specific requirement to do that. And this was a case where there was a requirement to change it. Now, some people might say, well, this is just reinforcing Korean propaganda. Well, that's a choice you have to make as a game developer. In this case, with Microsoft, they were trying to grow their games business. They knew that Korea was a very important gaming market. They also knew that real-time strategy games like Age of Empires are very popular in Korea. Another, StarCraft is another good example of a real-time strategy game, which has become a national phenomenon in Korea for the last 20 years. So this is one of those cases where it was a business decision to go ahead and make this change for the sake of building a business in Korea, but other developers may have made a different decision. Using faith in a game is also, something we obviously have to be very critical about and think about before we do it, because a lot of cultures maintain their expectations based on religious beliefs. So, for example, in Fallout 3, they had this two-headed Brahmin bull that would wander through the post-apocalyptic landscape. And unfortunately, this is what made this game not sellable in India, because the Brahmin bull is sacred to the Hindu faith. Now, they could have used like my poorly photoshopped two-headed horse, which would have worked perfectly fine, but they chose a Brahmin bull for various reasons. And unfortunately, they were not willing to change the animal. And so that's why this game did not sell in India. And similarly, both of these games had audio music files that had lyrics from the Islamic Quran, and that's why both of these games ran into some troubles, which I don't have the time to go into all the details behind all of these. I worked on the one on the left. But that's very complicated. You have to be very, very careful about the source material you're using. Even if it's just a small piece of audio, the lyrics were from the Quran, and that was a problem because of the context that it was being put into within the game. Inclusion and exclusion. What does this mean? Well, basically, when people perceive that they are being treated in an inequitable way, so they're being treated unfairly in the game on the basis of their culture or their ethnicity or their nationality or gender or all kinds of other factors. So, for example, in Resident Evil 5, when the game was first, before it even came out, the company was releasing these images of this white Caucasian male, shooting these Black African villagers. And so there was a lot of shock, especially in the United States, at this imagery because it's a very stark image. And the developers said, well, they didn't understand the controversy because they said, look, they're zombies, as you can see there on the right. So they said they didn't understand what's the big deal. What they didn't understand, and this is one of the reasons about context, is that this game being made in Japan primarily, Japan is 98% ethnic Japanese, and there's not the same level of understanding of diversity and racial tension as there is in somewhere like the United States. And so this imagery might be very sensitive in like the West, whereas in Japan, it's not sensitive at all. And so this is something that they should have done their homework on before they released images like this and before they took this approach. And they did make changes to the game before it finally released. Similarly, in Pocket God, you can see this depiction of indigenous people, which is by itself is a problem because you can see it's a very antiquated, notion of indigenous people with a bone in their hair and a grass skirt and little sharp animal-like teeth. The problem with this game is the whole point of this game is to torture them and to basically make them suffer. So you can, do all kinds of terrible things to them. What's interesting, though, is that the company said that these are not any particular cultural group. It's complete fiction. However, you could see on that island, they used a stone head, which is called a moai, which exists only in one place on Earth, in Easter Island. So by using that cultural artifact, they instantly made this a specific culture. And so that's why people were so upset. It's not just the depiction, but it was the depiction of a specific culture. And so you can see in later versions of the game, they actually used a different object. They created their own stone idol to basically make that separation. Intercultural tension is something we have to be mindful of. So this is where different cultures or nationalities have tensions between each other for all kinds of reasons, which could be historical or political. When Age of Empires 2 came out, it ran into problems because of the Japanese samurai on the box in Korea, because at the time, Korea and Japan were in a dispute over these disputed islands in the middle of the Sea of Japan. And so because of that heightened tension over the geopolitical dispute, a lot of Korean retailers did not want to put a box with a Japanese face on their shelves. And so in later versions of the game, in the expansion pack, you can see that most of the world saw the version on the top right with Montezuma in the center. But for Korea, we made a special box art only for the Korean market that shows a Korean general. And that was basically a way to sort of make up for the samurai mistake. And also things like gestures. So I've worked on all the Dance Central games, and gestures, of course, are very culturally specific. So that gesture he's making on the left is really close to the kind of middle finger gesture that you see, or the equivalent in France a lot. And the gesture she's making there, which for a lot of us means, it's a rock and roll. But in Italy, it means I'm sleeping with your wife. So, gestures are very culturally specific. So we have to be really careful about using gestures within our games for icons or for other purposes within the game. And then finally, geopolitical imaginations. And what I mean by this is basically this is a lot of map-based problems. So because governments like to reinforce what I call their geopolitical imagination about what they think they own. So like one of the problems here, like in this option screen on Ninja Gaiden, you can see here where it says country select, and it has the Taiwan flag, and then it has ROC for Republic of China. This will get you instantly banned in China because of the term ROC, which is not the term you use for Taiwan in China. It also is using the Taiwan flag, which will get you banned. And it's calling the Republic of China a country. So this is a very strong political statement that you are making if you are sending this game to China. But there's a really easy way to fix this, as you will see right now. So what you can do is you take the flag away because it's redundant information. You don't need to have it in there. And you use the term Taiwan because Taiwan is acceptable to both China and Taiwan. And then you say country/region, because then it's like, is Taiwan a region of China or is it a country? Well, that depends on your perspective as a user and as a player. And so basically it's not you, for the person making this game, it's not your problem to solve. Basically, you can leave the perception to the person actually using the game. And this is something we do in cartography all the time. This when I helped Google for several years perfecting what we call domain tailoring. So if you go to different domains, internet domains, you will see different maps, because in India, for example, this is northern India, it's required by law that you show the Kashmir territory as Indian territory. And if you don't show it as Kashmir as Indian territory, you can't sell your product in that market. And so, this is one of those strict requirements that you have to adhere to, or else you don't release your maps there. So finally, as I'm wrapping up here, I just want to emphasize the fact that, we live in a world where everything is distributed in the cloud. I think we all realize that now. And so when your game is released, it will be instantly exposed to a broad multicultural audience. So it's global ubiquity. Your game is out there and it's everywhere. And so if there's something that you made a mistake with in your game, even if it's not intentional, because most of the mistakes I see are not intentional, it's just mainly people did not do their research, or they were just ignorant about the situation. So once it's out there, though, it's out there forever, and there's no taking it back. And we all know this about the internet. And waiting for you on that other side of the screen is this huge community, which if you do something they really like, it's fantastic. The amount of love and feedback you get is really cool. But if you do something they don't like, then you know what's going to happen. And we all know the stories of what happens on the internet when people don't like something. And so do you want your game that you work so hard on, do you want it to be the focus of something like this, internet backlash, just because you didn't do your research on something, some content element within your game? The other part of this is complicated, is that governments and cultural institutions are constantly competing for public mind share. So a lot of times when we make a mistake in our games that is culturally offensive or politically offensive or something, a lot of times governments will use that as an example of how evil video games are, which obviously we don't feel that way, but we're still in a time when governments tend to, frown upon video games. That is changing, and it will change in time. But right now, this is a very big issue. It's one of the reasons why the Great Firewall of China exists. It's a reason why Russia implemented their sovereign internet law last year, which basically is trying to wall off the country from external influence. And, so basically in games are seen as one of those forms of negative influence. And so we have to also be thinking about that to a certain degree. However, that being said, I want to emphasize the fact that games are a creative form of self-expression. They are art. And so as a form of art, you should feel the right to exercise your creative vision, but you can't expect your creative vision to align with the expectations in other cultures, because it won't. It won't align with every culture. So you have to decide where you draw the line on what you're going to change or what you're not going to change for the sake of the integrity of your creative vision. And so you have to be conscious about all these decisions you're making during the world building process, because you're in this constant, struggle of what I call the fulcrum of compromise between having pure artistic freedom, but also trying to maximize your revenue. And if revenue is what's more important, then you're going to want to adapt your game for different markets so that it can sell in different markets around the world. But if artistic freedom is more important to you, then you probably won't make very many changes to your game. And if it doesn't sell in a certain country, that's fine. You're fine if it doesn't. That's not your concern. There is no right answer here. All of us, a lot of developers in the game space fall somewhere on this spectrum. And, it's basically up to you to decide. But my point is that you should be thinking about this aspect and this dynamic. What is important to you, and what are you willing to do to change your game and culturalize your game to make it more compatible with different markets around the world? And there you go. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to answer questions about this topic. You can even Google me. There's a lot of resources out there that where I've done longer presentations and have other things that might be helpful to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. And up next, our next speaker graduated from the Faculty of Electrical Engineering and Computing in Zagreb in 2016 and has been working at Nanobit ever since. They are a game developer and has worked on some of Nanobit's greatest hits like Hollywood Story and My Story. And when they're not doing that, they find the time to mentor several juniors across the Nanobit industry there. So let's welcome Marta Kunic.
Hello everyone, my name is Marta Kunic and today we're going to be talking about localizing mobile games. I am a game developer and I've been working in Nanobit for the last 4.5 years, currently in a position of a senior game developer. Our agenda for today is next one. First, I'm going to talk about Nanobit and then we're going to start with localization. Why did we decide to localize our games? How we did it, what were some problems, and what we gain in the end by localization. Nanobit is a game development studio from Zagreb. It was founded by Alen Sumina and Zoran Vucinic in 2008, and today it has more than 130 employees. We can proudly say that we have more than 3.5 million monthly active users, and that number is growing every day. And we also have more than 100 million downloads on both Apple and Google Play Store. We are completely in charge of products. That means we do everything in-house, we do our own art, we write our own code, and in the end, we test everything we do. In the last couple of years, interactive story games were our most popular products. It's something like a visual novel where you choose your character and you can choose what he or she is gonna do and how your story will end. And there's one problem there, and it is language barrier. So if you don't understand English, you're not able to fully enjoy in-game. It's like reading a book on a language that you don't understand. And our initial market reached saturation. It was harder and harder to find new users. So we were thinking, oh, what can we do? And then we had an idea. We could try to appeal to new markets by translating our game into their language. And there were some steps in that. Firstly, we did market analysis to see which languages were best for translation. So we decided to use German and French, and we translated our most popular story to those two languages. After that, it was huge success. We decided to localize our UI and also to translate some other stories. In the beginning, we used the device language as the default one, but later we decided to add option for user to change language, so you can play a little bit on English and then you can switch to Portuguese or to any other language. We localized in two parts. In our game, we have some assets that are in game bundle, and we'll have also some content that is downloading. So most of our stories are downloading from the internet. And then we decided, okay, maybe we could change that stories for users depending on the language they use. So our stories are represented as a set of instructions. You have some instructions that contain text such as show dialogue line or show narration, but there is also a large number of other instructions such as change scene, play sound, and that's not important for localization. So we decided to export raw text from all those instructions and translate that, and we created script to do that, and we also created another script that could put the text back in game. So basically, we exported all text from a story, translated it, and then imported it back in the game. And depending on the user language, we downloaded the correct version of story. So that was easy part. After that, we decided to localize UI, and that was a little bit harder because we never intended for our game to be localized, so we were not thinking about it while writing original code. First thing we had to do was to change all fonts because the fonts we used did not support all different alphabets, and then we decided, okay, we're gonna choose one font that supports all different alphabets and we can translate our game to any language and it will be okay. We created a script to do that, to go through all menu files and to replace fonts, but there was a little bit problem with that because not every font has the same height, so there were some things that needed to be done manually and to check manually. After that, we had some images that represented text, such as beautiful banners, and we needed to replace those with just regular image banner, and then text needs to be string. How did we translate all the text? We decided to do big dictionary for every language that contained all phrases that we used in games, such as congratulations, here's your reward, or collect this, or something like that. And to get all phrases that we needed, we also created a script that went through all menu files and extracted text that was used. But we also had some code, some text that was hard-coded as constants into a game. So we needed to manually go through all menu classes and see strings that were used, and we also added that to dictionaries. After that, we sent all phrases to be translated, and then when we put a string on a label in game, we know if it's something that was downloaded, and if that was downloaded, then it's on OK language. But if that's something that was in the bundle, then we need to translate it using the dictionary, and then we put it on a label. We also encountered some problems while doing this. So the first problem we had was text that was falling out of labels, because when we were doing our menus, we were not thinking about labels height and size, and we needed to auto-fit all of our text. So sometimes if the height was too big, it would go in 2 lines instead of 1. So we needed to go through all those problematic places and fix height of those labels. Another problem we had was with Japanese. Japanese language does not have blank lines, so we were thinking, okay, we're just gonna use our fixed size bubble and we're gonna put as many signs as we can in one line, and then we're gonna go to the new line. But our Japanese translators were not happy, because it turned out that in Japanese you cannot put new line anywhere, you can put it on specific places. So we were thinking, what are we gonna do? And then we calculated how many approximately Japanese signs we can put in one line. We told them that, and then they added manually new lines. And it is working now for this font size and for this bubble size. But if we ever decide to change that, then we're gonna have to go through all Japanese text and fix everything, change where new lines. We also had some problems with images that represented text, and as you can see here, on English it was okay, and then when we translated to Russian, the title stayed on English. That's because that's an image, not a text. So we needed to create new images with text for other languages, and then in code we set those pictures instead of the default one. What we gain in the end? We gain almost 700% increase in daily active users and 1,400 increase in daily profit. US still stays the primary source of income, but France and Germany have almost the same number of installs for 3.5 less cost. That means that we can get the same amount of users for cheaper price, because today you are not able to get new users if you don't invest in marketing. So we are experiencing high return for less cost. And since then we localized more games to 7 other languages. That was all. I know this was a little bit short, so if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Here's my email and my LinkedIn account.
Thank you, Marta. Now, Marta is also an avid baker, so maybe you can ask her all about cakes. But moving on, we've got one more speaker before our break. We're almost halfway through, and they're a developer advocate for Google Cloud Games and the founder of open source multiplayer dedicated game server scaling project Agons. Hailing from Australia, but currently in the Bay Area in San Francisco, let's welcome Mark Mandel.
name is Mark Mandel. I'm a developer advocate for Google Cloud, and today I want to talk to you about challenges introducing open source to the games industry. Something that is near and dear to my heart. I have a long history with open source in general, but over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, I've been doing more work to introduce and create open source in the gaming industry. So why don't we get sort of stuck in today? So to set the stage a little bit about me, one of the things I do is I work on an open source project specifically for Backend multiplayer games. This project is called GAMEDEV. Probably don't need to worry too much about what it does or how it works. But essentially, it's been a really successful, at least in my opinion, open source project in the games industry, specifically for building sort of this foundation for building multiplayer games at scale, especially for very large companies. It's been going really well. Currently running at over 3,000 GitHub stars. We've had over 90 contributors. We've done 40 odd releases in the last number of years. And if you go to the homepage for Agonez, you'll see that we have a multitude of companies using Agonez that are prominently displayed on the front page of our website. So I like to think we've done some really amazing work, and I'm super proud of the team and the contributors that we've had and the wide variety of people that we've had to come and be part of this project. But it's not all been smooth sailing. The gaming industry as a whole is a little different from the wider tech industry, culturally, technologically. And so there are specific challenges there around bringing open source and sort of bringing it into the gaming industry and helping the gaming industry see it as more of a norm than it probably does already. Just to be clear as well, there's lots and lots of stuff out there already about being successful in the open source industry, building open source projects, maintaining them, that kind of stuff. But today, I just want to talk specifically about the games industry and some of the challenges we faced and how we looked at trying to solve those as we tried to bring more open source tooling into the games industry. But before we get stuck in, let's talk a little bit about open source in general, just so we have a shared understanding of exactly what it is we're talking about. So to steal from Wikipedia, what we're talking about when we say open source software is we're talking specifically about free and open source software. That it is free as in doesn't cost anything. The source code is open so that you can see the source code and actually play with it and do stuff with it, but also that it comes with some kind of permissive license, maybe Apache 2 or MIT, basically some kind of license that enables you to do what it is that you want to do with it. And then I'm going to constrain this a little bit further because open source, even within those constraints, can mean a wide number of things. I want to talk specifically about projects that are what I refer to usually as plumbing. Basically, those foundational libraries, those foundational frameworks even, that present the building blocks of other things. Often this is sort of like where we look at things like open source projects like Linux, right? Operating systems are a great building block for being able to build other things on top of, such as applications and other things like that. So generally when I'm talking about open source and some of the challenges therein, what I'm talking about is propagating these building block sort of toolings, these libraries that have common reuse that people in the games industry can then stand on top of or build on top of so that they can reach even greater heights. Again, like plumbing inside your house, you need it. You know, those are the things that you have to have, you can't live without. But, you know, the thing that people look at when they come to your house, or maybe you're selling your house, maybe are your appliances or the layout. They don't look at the plumbing per se. They need to know it's there and it works. But at the end of the day, as long as it's there and it works, that's all they really care about. So also by the same token, you know, if you're doing these sort of building block libraries or frameworks or systems, they aren't necessarily the core mechanic of your game or something proprietary like that. It is usually something that you've built over and over again. Again, something like Agonez is a great example of this. A lot of people who have built multiplayer games have built sort of platforms for scaling dedicated game servers, which is what we do. So we wanted to help solve that problem. Okay, so I think we've set the stage a little bit there. So we had this great idea for an open source project, and we wanted to make sure that a lot of people in the games industry came and contributed, but also went and used it as well. And it wasn't necessarily easy. Open source isn't something that is the norm inside the games industry. And there are a few interesting challenges that we found along the way that were a little different than what we're used to in the wider technical community. So let's have a look at some, and then we'll also look at some of the ways we help try to work around them or potentially try and solve those issues. So firstly, not invented here, right? A very common problem we see in a bunch of places. Basically, some people really only trust the code that comes from within the company themselves that they work on or that they've written themselves. Maybe it's not quite as bad as I've highlighted here in this slide, but Not invented here is usually one of the biggest blocking things that we ran into. People often want to build things themselves. They feel like they trust them more. And sometimes that's definitely true. And so how do we necessarily combat that or come up with good solutions for that where people aren't as concerned with stuff that they haven't necessarily built themselves? Open source is great for that because people are able to see the source code. But ultimately, when it came down to it, we found that honestly, the best solution we could find was just build a better product. And open source is a great opportunity for doing that. Once we had a mature enough product and were able to show that to people who were working on similar types of things internally, often they were like, oh, this is actually better than what it is we have internally. And we're interested in taking it on board. So having that incentive for tooling that is one step beyond what it is they might have internally made a huge argument for being able to have that adoption happen. And often open source is just really a great space for this. You know, you can necessarily possibly have a much larger group of people working on it than you would do inside a company. You probably also would have a more diverse set of people with more diverse backgrounds and more diverse expertise being able to provide feedback, be able to provide product enhancements, things like that, to be able to build a tool that enables a wide variety of use cases. And open source provides a great opportunity for building a platform wherein you can actually not have that kind of technical debt that sometimes languishes in production systems for a very long time. Because you're building in the open with a variety of people, quite often that technical debt either gets removed, or because you have such a wide expertise, or probably also just because you don't have the pressures of certain deadlines looming, you don't necessarily want to cut corners or have to cut corners to get things live that may not necessarily have the time to go back and remove. So open source is a great opportunity to just build it better, and it can also be one of the ways of solving that challenge of not invented here as well. This is one of my favorite ones as well. I don't know if other people have noticed, but secrecy is definitely a thing in the games industry. Sometimes it can be hard, either for lawyer reasons or just other cultural reasons. Getting people to talk about what it is they do in the open can sometimes be difficult, especially when it comes down to technical details. So how do you get around this, or maybe not get around this, but how do you help solve this issue when open source by its very nature is open and transparent? So one of the best ways I've found for helping resolve this in a way is sort of by leading by example. So when you build an open source project, especially if you have a really large one or one that's being quite successful, being an example of transparency is super important. What do I mean by that? I mean that make sure that decisions are made in the open. GitHub issues are a great solution for this. Just make sure everything's done through GitHub issues or just some sort of formal process for how decisions get made. If you have a governance model, especially if you're big enough to do that, that specifies how decisions get made, how documentation gets written, who gets assigned approval rights for things, again, make sure that's all open and in the clear. Just make sure that there's no unfortunate hidden rooms where decisions happen and people can feel like they're either left out or decisions are made somehow with motives that they don't understand. Often, easiest way of doing this, making sure everything's on GitHub issues. If you have a chat conversation and you want to take advantage of a chat medium and a decision happens in there, just make sure there's an audit trail for that. Take a copy paste of that transcript, chuck it up on GitHub, write some notes about it, and then people have more opportunities also to respond if need be. Not only will that result in a better open source project, but it'll also make your community feel like they're involved and give them opportunity for input as well. This helps with the whole secrecy thing and people not feeling comfortable to share, because when you have an environment where the cultural norm is to share, quite often they'll come in and be like, oh, now I understand my expectations for what it is I should be doing here. And they're more inclined to see a different way through. Oh, they're like, okay, in this environment, I can see that this open honesty and being able to share stuff is a nice way of being able to do this and gives me a good way forward. They then can go back. Maybe they have to talk to lawyers. That's a thing. Some projects have contributor license agreements, for example. That's a thing you need to go through. Just so that they can take part. But if they see the benefits of that open and transparent nature, then they're willing to do that because the incentive is there. Sometimes though, that's just not enough. I think, you sort of have to be pragmatic about this sort of stuff. Sometimes if you need to set up a private channel, then just that's something you need to do. Maybe you might have a specific mailing list for talking to a specific customer or a specific user about very specific issues or proprietary type things that they're doing. Or you just set up, a Zoom or a Hangout, something like that, where you can have a face-to-face conversation that doesn't necessarily involve all the parties. Sometimes that's just the thing you have to do. What I would recommend though, is if you do have that private conversations and maybe, there's a feature request that comes out of that or something similar, what I would do is start a document outlining what it is that you were going to be working on. Say it's a feature request and you write through the details and just get confirmation from both sides. Hey, is it okay if this particular part is made public? Not all the other stuff we were talking about. Maybe there was some proprietary or very specific game specific stuff in there that we don't want to share. But yeah, if you can come up with at least part of that being, okay, this part can be public, we're going to publish it. Maybe we're not going to attribute it to who it is and who it's from. Also totally fine. And then if you have agreement, then that can go live and then that sort of can be discussed as well. So if you have to do private channels, that's a thing, totally fine. Just, manage expectations appropriately, see if you can make some of that public and move forward from there. So this is another one as well. As we've been talking about, open source isn't necessarily the norm in the games industry. So quite often, engineers who work on games aren't as familiar with how open source works, or even how Git works or the tooling works, all that kind of stuff. So what do you do then, right? Like you may have people who want to contribute or use the stuff you're doing, but they just aren't familiar with the platforms. Unfortunately, that means you're going to have to spend some of your time educating. Especially if you have a very successful open source project, the bigger it gets, the more you're going to have to spend some of your time educating people about how Git works, how pull request works, that kind of stuff. I would highly recommend either pointing to or linking to some documentation about how this works. There's a lot of it out there, and giving people some best practices. But yes, expect that you're going to be telling people about Git and GitHub. Those are the things that some people aren't necessarily familiar with. Games industry people are usually very familiar with Perforce, for example, but aren't necessarily as familiar with those tools. Also, probably aren't as familiar with like common open source procedures, like how does a pull request work? Should I draft it? Should I not draft it? And having some guidelines in your repository about how to do that, or just, being able to push people to those guidelines when they do ask those questions, or if they potentially have necessarily not done it the way that your repository would like, or are just common in terms of how usually open source projects work. And there's probably also going to be some open source community etiquette. People not being involved with these kinds of communities before, maybe they don't know, right? For example, in the project we work on, we say, and quite a lot of number ones do this as well, but we say, if you're going to do a big chunk of work, write an issue with the design in it first so that we can talk about it before you go on this big path of doing all this stuff and then kind of just dropping it. That's a very common thing to write. Sometimes, it can be quite disruptive if that happens as a maintainer, but also it may not be the path or the architecture decision that the project maintainers want to go down, so we don't want you to waste your time. If you're not used to open source, you may just think you're doing a great thing, which is totally awesome, and we love it when people do stuff like that. But yeah, that's just something you're going to end up doing. Like sometimes you're like, this is awesome, thank you so much for doing this work. Unfortunately, it would be really great if you could do this. Please come back and do a design ticket. We would love you to do that and we can talk about it. Maybe this is in the right direction, that kind of stuff. So some empathy goes a long way. Some people skills definitely goes a long way. Just be aware you're going to end up sort of doing some of this education work as you continually go forward. And I'll also say you'll probably want to spend some time actively recruiting contributors. Again, games industry isn't necessarily the norm for open source. We keep saying this, and it's definitely true. And so that means that quite regularly, people will come, use your stuff, leave, which is fine. And generally for open source as well, that's pretty much the norm in some ways too. The vast majority of people are going to use your stuff rather than contribute. Totally reasonable. But I would recommend, as people come and ask questions, or especially if they ask particular questions about particular features, this is always one of my favorites. Somebody will come and say, hey, this thing that you've written an issue for, this looks awesome. When is it coming? And maybe no one's actively working on that. Open source projects, people come and go. And that's a great opportunity to say things like, that would be great. Unfortunately, no one's working on that right now. Would you be interested in working on it? Not only does that help them sort of answer that question about, okay, there's no one doing anything on that right now, but it also helps you as a maintainer to say, okay, please come in. Like I would like you to come in and I will help you do that. Again, you're probably gonna have to do some education maybe to help them get on board with the tooling and the process if they aren't familiar. But, you might have to do that 10 times, 20 times, and you'll pick up 1 or 2 contributors. But do always be actively recruiting. Active recruitment is something you're just going to have to do. And it is going to be the thing that will help grow your project anyway. Always be looking for people. And actually, I will also say active recruitment, when I say contributors, it doesn't necessarily also have to mean coders. Contributors can be people who are people who hang out inside your chats, your discords, your slacks, or your mailing lists, help people out. People who are contributors, people who help with documentation, people who help with code, people maybe who have design or UX skills. Depends on your project, but contributing can really mean a variety of stuff. So make sure you aren't focused on just one area there. You want to reward and bring people in who can help with all areas. And that'll help you scale out your project as you pull in more people, and you can delegate more to more people as your project gets more successful, because your project's going to be amazingly successful, I'm sure. Finally, I just want to say, like, a call to action. Open source is near and dear to my heart. I love open source, and I think it could be a real tool for change inside the games industry about how we build games and how we build the platforms that support games. And I want to see more people writing open source, talking about open source. So if you're doing anything with open source, you're authoring stuff or contributing stuff, tell it to the world. Put it out on Twitter, talk about it at conferences, put it out on videos. I'd love to see more stuff about open source in the industry, best practices, things. What challenges have you seen that I haven't seen? I would love to hear about those. Hit me up on Twitter at Neurotic or other social mediums. I would love to see more discourse about this subject. I'd love to see more people writing stuff. I'd love to see more contributors. Open source is just fantastic. So please, spread the message to the world. Tell people about it. If you want to get involved, there's lots and lots of projects out there as well. So finally, if you're interested in open source and you want to see some of the stuff that I work on that I really love, I'll point you to some of the resources that we have at Google. So if you're interested in any of the open source stuff that we do at Google for Games, github.com/Google for Games has some of the open source projects that I work on, including Agones as well as some others. If you want to see there's another list as well. We have an open source directory that you can see at opensource.google.com. If you go to the gaming category, you can see a whole bunch of projects that are available that we contribute to, as well as author. We actually have way more than I realized, which is kind of cool as well. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my employer as well. So I work for Google. If you're interested in anything that Google Cloud or Google does for gaming, you can check out cloud.google.com/gaming or just games.withgoogle.com if you want a broader look at what happens across all of Google as well, if you're looking for particular Google-based solutions. Finally, as I mentioned before, if you want to follow me, you think I might be some interesting stuff, you can reach me at Twitter at Neurotic. Occasionally I do some open source live streaming when I do some work on the projects I work on. So you can see me up on Twitch at Mark Mandel. And you can see recordings, some of my presentations, other work I've done as well about explaining backend systems for games at youtube.com/Mark S. Mandel. Finally, thank you so much for spending time with me. I know your time is valuable and I really appreciate it. I hope you learned some stuff. I hope you have learned some things about how to make open source successful in the games industry, and I hope you go out and build some awesome open source stuff. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark. And with that, we're at the halfway mark. This is your chance to go for a break. You got 5 minutes. Grab yourselves a drink, get yourselves back in front of your screens, and we'll see you again soon. Don't go too far. We'll see you soon. Welcome back. If you can hear my voice, this is your cue to get back in front of your screen after that break. I know, 5 minutes goes so quick. I'm in London and it's currently super hot. I don't know what the weather's like where you are. Let us know in the chat. Tell me how you're feeling. I always love to hear from people, especially when they've been on a break, because who knows what people have got up to. But anyway, moving back into our conference, our next speaker is a biologist and computer scientist by education, but actually a game developer by pure love. They've got a fixation on simulating, prototyping and designing mechanics to invoke emotions, and they've tried every form of game development from 20 players through to 10 million players. They've also said here in their bio, they've got a problem with shutting up, so I can see exactly why they've become a speaker. I'm delighted to welcome for us Marta Fizak.
Hi, my name is Marta Fiak, and I'm here today to talk to you about Ghost in the Shell, the Authorial voice and system design. To get those things out of the way, a few words about me. I'm a game designer focusing on game systems, and currently I work at 11-bit Studios as a lead game designer on an unannounced project. So let's jump straight into the topic that we are going to conquer today. So the Authorial voice and system design. To start first, let's discuss what is the authorial voice, right? So it's the unique style, perspective, point of view or tone that the artist or the creator, doesn't matter the label, puts inside his work. And it doesn't matter if it's a movie, if it's a piece of music, if it's a painting, always there is a creator behind it, and he always wants to convey something. It can be extremely convoluted, it can be extremely simplistic, but the creator is there and he is passing something to the audience. And he can do it in many ways through the style, perspective, and the point of view and tone. Because the thing is, this is not journalistic work, so that creation is not a representation one-to-one of the actual subject, because if it was that, then it would look exactly the same from creator to creator, and this is not the case, and this is the manifestation of authorial voice. And let's look on the movies at the beginning about that. So here we have 3 movies. On the far left and the far right side, we have 2 movies about indie games. I don't know, have you seen both of them, but the subject is the same. Those are movies that follow a group of people who have a dream to make games, to make them independently. But the conclusion and the tone of both of those movies couldn't be further apart. Indie Game, the movie, is a celebration. It's a celebration of creators, it's a celebration of the works, and it's a really nice view of how it goes. And it's a story of success. And everything is alright. So the one far on the right, it's not that. It's a more realistic, gritty picture of the situation of the indie creators have to face to show the game to a broader audience. So the same subject, but the authorial voice and the authorial intent was far, far different from one to another. The same thing you have with the movie in the middle. This is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I don't know if you watched it, but this is a musical from far, far back, and it came out when musicals were fairly popular, but that one has a really strong creator's style in it, and it till today has a strong cult following, and was one of the things that shifted the perspective of the audience about human sexuality too. Okay, it's a little bit of a stretch, but still, this movie has a really unique tone, really unique style, taking the normal cliche of a castle and monstrosity living inside of it. And we can look through that authorial voice lens also on books. In here you have 3 books. You have The Catcher to the right, the 1994, and Joseph Heller Paragraph 22. And starting from the last one, this is a quite unique look on war, because you have many books that shows the war in its glorious and bravery and that wonderfulness of masculine combat. And Joseph Heller approached the same topic with a totally different angle, showing how nonsensical the whole endeavor is. The subject the same, the authorial voice different. And the same with The Catcher in the Rye, because you have many books of coming of age. That's the one that got banned. It wasn't good or not that it got banned. It's a different story. So, once again, a strong manifestation. And in the middle, the 1984, the famous anti-utopia. Not the first one, the Brave New World was before it, as far as I can recall. But once again, a totally different approach to a quite similar subject. So the question is how it works further in paintings. So here we have the Guernica from Pablo Picasso, said to be one of the most brutal and realistic depictions, maybe not realistic, not the proper word, but the most impactful depictions of the horrors of war and suffering. And you can put it in the contrast with the painting by Goya, which is also the one on the left, is also showcasing the horrors of it. This was an uprising, if I recall correctly. And the one on the right is just because I like it, this is just Saturn devouring his own children by Goya. I find it kind of fitting in terms of game design, but it's not that tough. But as you can see, both in movies, in books, in paintings, there's a lot of space to show the intent of the creator, and the creator can have strong authorial voice. And the question is, are games same? And can we do that in games in terms of the freedom of artistic expression? I'm not going to touch this time around the subject of the production environment, because games are made, the bigger one, by a lot of people. And the question is, who is the creator and where the authorial voice lies? But this is not that subject. Let's talk about if games are capable of that, because if they are, then we can discuss who can do that in terms of a game. So, how it works in games. We have few channels in games. The most obvious one is the story. And of course, a really strong authorial intent can be shown there. As here we have the Uncharted, and this game through its story conveys a really simplistic but greatly done fantasy of an Indiana Jones-esque character. And on the other hand, using exactly the same layer of games. The story, we have Go Home, which touches a lot more delicate subject. It's a story of coming out with a really strong authorial intent, with a really strong creator showcasing and manifesting inside of his work. But that's not all. As we already seen, paintings can have that strong way to convey message. Visuals and music can do exactly the same in games because they are there. So here we have, once again, to juxtapose things. On one hand, the gears of war. From just looking at that picture, you can see that strong masculine power fantasy, war and grittiness of it, and everyone is huge and buffed, and there's going to be killing. And this is only by the picture itself, only by how visually designed those things are. And on the other hand, you've got games like Hellblade, which do the same, like not the same, but using the same tools in terms of visuals and music, convey a totally different message and a totally different mood, as this is a game about mental illness and about horrific impacts of war, of scars coming from war on human psyche. And through every scene in that game, this is really, really strongly communicated, and it kind of pours out of the screen. But that makes sense that those two things works like in the based medium, so the story and the visual and music. But the question is, what about the mechanics, the unique part of our medium? Because those are the things that make games interactive. And are they okay to pass the authorial intent inside of them, or are they there only to provide then the engagement? And as you may find out from the topic of the subject, I'm on the side that yes, of course they can, but to delve more deeply into how they do that, let's first get back to basics and discuss what mechanics are and how they work together to, have a nice ground for the next part. So first, let's discuss mechanics and their relation to each other, because mechanics are there to create game loops. And we will use the Michael Seller's definition of game loops just to put things into perspective. So game works in loops, and we've got 5 types of loops. Not all of them have to be present in all of the games, but at least the first one is that, and this is the action feedback loop. This is something that I do over and over again in a span of seconds. So when we think in terms of chess, the action feedback loop would be me picking up the piece and moving it. In terms of chess, this is not the part that creates the engagement, as this is not extremely entertaining, because what is things that happen in the short-term and long-term cognitive loop, so the next 2 stages. So the short-term cognitive loop, it's me planning a few steps ahead. So I want to do that, I see the player do, my opponent do another thing, so I change in my mind what I'm going to do, and I adjust my strategy. And this is something that happens on longer time frames. So I'm doing the action feedback thing, I'm trying to get my goals in the short term, just for example having that piece in a certain place, but I have to readjust because the opponent is there and he is kind of destroying my wonderful plans to win. And on top of that, there's the long-term cognitive loop, and this is my grand strategy. I want to put those pieces in certain places to be able to win. But, of course, once again, there's the opponent, he's destroying my things. But I'm using the action feedback, I'm doing the small chunks of the plan in the short-term cognitive loop to get to my long-term cognitive loop plan of destroying him and having, the grand victory over him. And there's also the emotional and the cultural loop, and they are longer, and sometimes they happen outside of the game, and this is me reliving some parts. This is me thinking about them in terms of the culture around us and how my play was correlated, for example, in the cultural terms, to strategies enacted by war tacticians in some faraway combats or something like that. So this is the emotional and cultural loop that may happen outside of the play itself, but not all of game have them. And sure, this is one part, but the second part is how those things are created. So how those loops come to be. And this is the second part, going after Brian Upton's, that the gameplay itself, it's a free movement in a system of constraints. So what does it mean? It means that through the rules that we create as game designers, so through the mechanics and systems, we create a set of states that the player can freely move to. So looking on that beautiful picture, the player is that smiley face in the middle. From that position that he is in, he can move to 4 different states. So still sticking to chess, this is 4 different moves he can make in that point of the game. Not all of them are valid in terms of the long-term planning of the player. Not all of them make sense, but mechanically the game allows them to happen. So this is the system of constraints, all of those states that the player may move into. And the free movement is the player picking where to go. So in the end of the day, all of the states that the game can be are designed by the designer, but due to sheer amount of those states, we rarely design them by hand. We design a set of rules and a set of mechanics that create those states. So in terms of chess, the different patterns of movement for different pieces are those small mechanics that can create different states, because the play space can be only in that set of configuration that comes out both of the shape of the board and the rules of moving those pieces. So the player has a free movement through that space that we created. So this is the system of constraints. So mechanics, we know what they are. They create the rules, they create the space, they working together create the loops that player goes over and over in. So where's the authorial voice inside all of that? And I'm postulating that the authorial voice manifests in all of the states, because as we are designing the rules, we are showing our view of the world, and those states come off the rules that we just created. And if we want it or not, our intent is in there. So we as game designers are responsible for all of the states that can be generated by the system. The thing is, okay, not all of them, because currently we were talking about states that have an actual representation in the game. And those are not all states that happen while we are playing, because there's one set of states that has the representation, on the board in a set of chess, for example in the game of chess. But there's also another set of states that mostly happen when we are dealing with a more heavy narrative, or we are dealing with actually reading a book, because you can use that kind of approach to analyzing how a person reads a book. And this is interpretation states. So while I'm reading, or while I'm enjoying a game that is a walking simulator in the end of the day, what is happening in my mind is I'm having a lot of states that I pick from, but those are not states representing the game state. Those are states representing my interpretation of the things that are happening inside of the game. And what I'm doing is trying to figure out what's happening, or what the characters are going to do. And due to a lot stronger involvement of the player himself in creation of those interpretation states, taking responsibility for them is hard, because they are a co-creation between the creator and the end user. So now the question is, because if we say that the states are manifested that the authorial voice is manifested in the states, this is quite, intellectual and theoretical approach to games. And the question is, does anyone care? And do players read those states as an authorial intent inside of the game? And as you already know, yeah, they do, because we have the stories like the Reward We Are Woman controversy, where there is a set of mechanics that define the behavior of those little humans. I don't know, have you played that game? And those rules reflect a certain view of the world and view of those topics. And to be clear, I'm not in here against or pro what Reward did. This is not important at this moment. What is important is the fact that the defense that the author of the game was trying to use is that it's just mechanic. I wasn't trying to say anything. But the thing is, they say anything. We create those things, so they are a kind of extension of our views. If we want it or not, we are saying something. And the same thing is with video game romance, that was broken for a quite long time, because if you look at it from a further point of abstraction, they work like vending machines for sex. As you have a character that you want to have a romance with, and you just say nice things or proper things. It depends on the game. And eventually, if you do it long enough, a sex scene will pop out. And this is a really weird view on human relationships, and this is a really, really skewed approach to how human relationships work. And of course, it's a simplification, but it makes sense that players after a while were like, that's a weird view, that's why and how. And that also happened with the game I was working on. It was the Frostpunk game, because I will talk about it in a second, but Frostpunk works like that in the end, it will show you an ending that is based on your choices. It's more complicated than a normal branching narrative. There's a system behind it that tracks what you do and how you do it and when you do it. And in the end, if we, from our European-centric approach, think that you have crossed the line, we will show you a question, was it worth it? Just like that. And as I already underlined it was our European-centric approach, because it was fueling quite strong debate in China, where their approach was totally different. And the question, was it worth it, that came strictly out of mechanics and balance of our mechanics, was the weirdest and inappropriate question, because the city survived. So why? Why the question? So let's discuss it on an actual case, how that thinking about authorial voice and the creator's intent comes into play when you are actually designing a system or doing something. So the question and the case that we're going to look on is Frostpunk, and what are we willing to sacrifice for gameplay. So to put things into a perspective, Frostpunk is a survival city builder, society survival city builder game that tells the story of the last city on Earth. The Earth has frozen to the bone, and the humanity has fled far north to the last city in a crater in the ground that is going to be the new beginning and a new start for them. But the setup is quite hard. It's everything's against them, the temperature is, but also humans inside. And this is the society aspect, because our little humans inside of that game are not only workers like you would think in Age of Empires, but they also have their own needs, their hopes. They can demonstrate, they can create a mutiny and all of those things. So it's a society survival game. And due to the fact many things, bad things happen to those little humans. And one of them is a frostbite, because it's extremely cold and things may happen. And eventually, if a wound is not treated, it may actually result in amputation. And now the question was, during the development, what to do with the amputees. How hardly does it sound? But still, what to do with the amputees? Because in terms of gameplay itself, it's a penalty for not having enough heat in workplaces, to simplify it the most. So if you as a player are neglecting both the safety and the temperature in the workplaces, this is one of the in-game penalties. Your workforce would get smaller and smaller and smaller, because a lot of people won't be able to work due to amputations and loss of limbs. But as we found out playing and balancing the game in the future, the sheer amount of workforce stopped being a problem in later parts of the game, because you start a game with a really small settlement, but that settlement grows. And the workforce reduction is not something that you as a player feel. So, as we have that strong society part, we started to discuss what we can do with that subpopulation that created of amputees to further push the point that the player has to keep the right temperature in those places. The first approach that I proposed was just adding for those people a chance for suicide, because they feel like a burden, they cannot contribute to what is happening outside, and why not? If a little human in our society commits suicide, then it impacts the whole city, because the hope falls, the discontent rises, or the people do not react okay for that kind of occurrences. So we put that in the game, started playing, but the percentage was, the chance was not hitting strong enough. I still didn't feel the penalty. So I was rebalancing and increasing that number. And eventually, I started to play and I felt like, yeah, I really, as a player, try to avoid that situation because the impact of that is quite big. And in terms of gameplay and in terms of gameplay loop, it worked quite nicely. It steered my behavior away from having cold places and more forward, carrying before anything bad happens. And then I looked on the numbers, and the problem was every person after amputation had every day a 50% chance to commit suicide, which is far from my view of the world, and this is far from anything realistic. It works in terms of the gameplay, but in terms of the authorial intent and the creation, and what we're trying to say as creators was far, far off. So discussion started what we can do to make it better, because simply adding those numbers was not enough. And that way, a whole arc was created. So we moved away from a really simplistic approach, just having a chance of suicide, and created a need for those people to be part of the society again. And it created a whole arc of small stories that they can protest, that they need prosthetics, that they want to be needed again, that they want to help, that they want to contribute, they want to be a strong part of the society that are in. And when we play around it with that, it once again presented the gameplay cost that we wanted, because this content is a penalty that was enough to make the player don't want to get to that place in the first place. But still, it also allowed, if that already happened, to represent something that I align with and that part of the team also aligned with, that tells a more compelling story through the mechanics about those people. So having them protest, having little stories, how it impacts their little life, and having a whole system of creating prosthetics, which is economically harsh, as in terms of it requires a lot of resources, which once again creates a penalty and a risk-reward situation for the player. And it kind of worked. Coming from that approach of not only gameplay, but what we are saying, resonated really nicely with the players, and that's awesome. But what is important is that not only systems are the problem, and you already saw that in the previous example, that systems are one thing, and the systems may be okay, but the balance may be extremely off. Because in the semi-realistic systems, math is not only there for fun, it's an expression of a personal view. So we can imagine, having a game like This War of Mine about war, and the numbers that you put in there create my perspective of being a person surviving during war. So if I think there's abundance of things, I will put the numbers really high, and it will create a bizarre experience that may be aligned with my personal conviction about that. But this is not true. The question is what I'm trying to do. Sorry. So, but now it's, sound kind of dim and green that you have to think about all of the things and you can do it for fun. But the truth is, not all games are like that. Not all games have that strong component of an authorial voice, or strong component of an authorial voice that may have more strong consequences when reaching your players, because you have also an extremely set of games that are abstract games. And when you're dealing with that, you can go wild both with your systems and both with the mathematics, because when root in reality, you show your own view of reality. But when not, feel free to play around, but of course, there is a thin line with everything. But to sum all of that up, what I wanted to convey and what is important for me is that to be aware and design and balance responsibly, because everything you do is your representation of the world, if you want it or not. So be aware that you are saying something and check from time to time if you are actually saying what you want to say. Thank you.
Thank you there, Marta. Let's hope you got something out of that. Let us know by going to the chat, as always. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what you're thinking. But maybe just ask a question. Hopefully someone will be in there to answer that for you. But moving on, our next speaker has been working at Google since April 2018 as a cloud developer advocate. And before that was a high school coding instructor. In their spare time, they enjoy playing volleyball, baseball or softball. And we're proud to introduce to you John Faust.
Hi, and welcome to Open Match, an open source matchmaking framework. Thank you for joining me while we explore matchmaking services, why it can be a challenge to build them, and a solution built by a community. So a little bit about myself. My name is John Faust. I'm a developer advocate for Google Cloud for Games, and I've been there for roughly 2.5 years. Previously, I was a software engineer working on medical software, so it's definitely a big yet fulfilling career change. I'm also a STEM instructor where I teach students who are ages 11 through 18 on programming fundamentals using C# and Python. And my interest obviously is in gaming, so I've played a ton of multiplayer online games, each with their own matchmaking issues. So before we start, what is matchmaking? So matchmaking enables players to be grouped together to play a game. Ideally, they should be grouped together for some combination of skill level, latency, possibly if you want to incorporate languages to make sure that you don't have a barrier, you can do so, and other factors that will create a more enjoyable experience. So if your players are happy, they'll stick by your game for a while. So let's explore the traditional matchmaking service architecture. So firstly, matchmaking is one of the hardest problems to solve for online multiplayer games. Looking at this graphic, the matchmaker, which is depicted by the large blue square, takes players and connects them to your game in forms of groups termed as matches and connects them to game servers. So creating a good match is critical for your game, and what constitutes a good match changes from game to game. So no match logic is always going to be the same. In general, making a good match for your game is relatively hard, but it is very core for your game's design. So running this at a global scale for your player population presents a new and completely whole different set of challenges. Designing a matchmaker service that can run reliably at scale is very hard, and it may not be interesting enough for a game developer to tackle. So let's explore some of these matchmaking issues you might come across. So your service can become overwhelmed. This typically means that you've exhausted the compute resources allocated for your matchmaker. And the solution is typically not, hey, let's throw more game servers at it. You have long queue times. No one enjoys waiting long stretches of time to play a game. I personally waited up to 7 to 12 minutes for a game, which ended up resulting in me dequeuing or canceling my matchmaking request and just quitting the game or playing something else. So it's a bit extreme, but there are some players who see these long queue times and ultimately would just drop your game. And nothing is more enjoyable, and this is sarcasm, than playing with someone who's levels above you. And this is all because of bad logic. Imagine entering a game where you're level 1 and you're playing against someone who's level 40. Fun, right? Not really. So your bad logic can definitely deter players from staying in your game. And there are even more ways that people can abuse, say, a leveling system, which includes boosting and smurfing. So boosting, for definition, is helping someone who's a low level reach higher ranks. And it goes hand in hand with smurfing, because a high level player can pretend to be a low level player and play alongside this low rank player and completely demolish people in this low rank player's skill rating or skill range and help them climb quickly. So this causes a lot of toxicity, as well as an unenjoyable experience for a lot of people, because imagine, once again, playing with someone who's level 40 and you're level 1, and it's very hard. It breaks up team synergy, because if, for example, the player gets placed in a higher ranked match, their team is not going to want to work with them because of the fact that they're so low level, but they're pretending to be, or they've been boosted to a higher level. So this is where we explore OpenMatch. So OpenMatch is an open source matchmaking framework that was co-founded with Unity. It is focused on flexibility, scalability, and extensibility, which we'll explore later on. And it is written in Go and runs natively on Kubernetes. So what are the benefits of running OpenMatch on Kubernetes? So when you break down the large blue box, which was your monolith matchmaker, into maintainable services, you can easily track bugs, performance, and even see what is going on in each one of the services through logging. Now, scalability is one of the big things that you have to consider when you don't want to be hit with a large surge of players and your matchmaker goes down. So Kubernetes provides a autoscaler that allows you to horizontally scale your matchmaker based on CPU and RAM usage. What it'll typically do is, if you are hit with a lot of traffic in one of your services, it will increase the number of pods. And what it does is it will help deal with a lot of the matchmaking requests that are coming in. But the great thing about it is it also shrinks down once that player load has hit like a lower peak. Now, what happens when your matchmaking service is overwhelmed and it's hit very, very hard and the scaling just doesn't work, although it typically does? Kubernetes has auto recovery. What this does is, if your service goes down for any reason, whether it's hit by a large surge of players, like completely unanticipated large scale players, or there's a bug that in your matchmaking, what happens is it will turn off the service, it will restart the service, and it will disconnect your players from the matchmaker until it has recovered. And Kubernetes auto recovery is typically very fast. And the last thing is extensibility. So Kubernetes exposes the endpoints for your services or pods, which allows you to add functionality such as load balancing and even securing network traffic between these services. So now the question is, why open source? So collaboration results in a better solution for everyone. And it is also you can also build things with flexibility in mind, with no need to reinvent the wheel. Ultimately, what this means is the matchmaker is unique for everyone. So building it for one use case won't benefit all developers. So I've been using the term framework quite often because OpenMatch was built in mind for any developer who wants the functionality in any matchmaker without having to build it from scratch. So this gives the developer more freedom and more time to spend on the logic that connects your players together for an enjoyable experience and keeps your players around. So let's explore the OpenMatch architecture. So the blue boxes are the external services that developers need to create to work with OpenMatch. This means accessing data, player data, authentication, and any other services or any other platform services your game might have, such as inventory and game saves. And also there are things, external services such as finding available game servers for your matchmaker. So respectively, that's what the game front end and the director will do. So these white blocks that you see in the architecture represent the core services of OpenMatch or the core functionality of a matchmaker you would normally build. So we'll explore what all of these services do later on. And then you have the bread and butter of what makes your matchmaker, which is those customizable services, the match function, and the evaluator. Those things we'll dive into a little bit detail later on, but just know that this is what makes your matchmaker your matchmaker. So now let's talk about tickets. So tickets are the most fundamental structure in OpenMatch that will go through most of the services, and they represent the matchmaking requests for a player or a group of players. So on the left-hand side, I've given you the code snippets for protos for the ticket as well as search fields. So to dive a little bit what protos do, they allow you to actually, as long as you satisfy the requirements of a proto, you can create a ticket structure. And that means that if you can use a REST API or gRPC to send all of this data that satisfies this proto, you can create a matchmaking ticket. Now, the search fields are a proto that define the basic and unique criteria for your ticket or your matchmaking request. And this includes what type of game mode your player wants to play in, what is their skill level, what potential roles do they want to queue for, if they want to queue for multiple roles or just one, their latency, their region, their preferred language. And there are also things that you can add on top of it if you want to really get really funky with it and say things like, hey, this player is a known cheater. I want to be able to place them into matches with known cheaters. You can set that as a flag in your tickets. So to use the graphic on the right to represent tickets, we have a large player pool that this blue circle is entering. And this is going to be all players who want to have a matchmaking experience. Now, notice that the shapes, the colors, and sizes are all different. This can represent, for example, blue can represent that a player is queuing for a tank role. Circle can represent the type of game mode that the player is queuing for. And then the actual shape itself will represent, not the shape itself, but the size of the shapes represent the player's skill level. So the smaller the shape, the lower the skill level, the larger the shape, the higher the skill level. So now we're going to talk about profiles. So profiles are the template for the match criteria. Essentially what happens is, if I want to create a 1v1 match with players, then I can set that as a requirement for a match. And if I want to set additional criteria for the 1v1, such as to ensure that these tickets that are being filtered into ticket pools or tickets that have met the criteria for this particular match profile, what happens is I will set criteria such as I want to have players that have a skill range from 1100 to 1500, for example, that are queuing up for, say, a mage role or a swordsman role. That way, when you have your 1v1, you can have players that are in the same role and similar skill level. So based on the graphic, you can see we have the larger pool that we normally had in the previous slide, and we've broken it down into smaller ticket pools that represent all blue, all purple, all green, and all squares. So notice that there's a mix of everything, whether you have the same shapes, the same colors, or if you want to, you can do it based off skill, so the same size shapes. So let's talk a little bit more about OpenMatch's core services. So we have the OpenMatch front end, which handles the initial matchmaking requests or when tickets are created and submitted to OpenMatch. It is also responsible for deleting tickets or when the game front end sends a request to OpenMatch to cancel a matchmaking request. It also deletes those tickets. And you can also get the information or details of a ticket, which include how long it's been in the queue and other things such as whether it has received an assignment. Then we have our game backend, OpenMatch backend. So what this is responsible for is creating matches and assigning dedicated game servers. So this will be invoked by the director, which is the external service, which is going to say, hey, I want to assign these tickets to, I want to assign these servers to these tickets. and it will send a group of game servers for the match profiles to then go through all of the tickets that match these that have met the requirements for these match profiles and make sure that their assignments are updated. And the last one is the query service. So the query service actually looks at the ticket pools, such as the all blue, the all green, the all purple, and the all squares. It will look at those ticket pools to then execute additional logic on top of it so that you can put players together in competitive and fair matches. Essentially, the match function is triggered by the query service so that it can find those tickets that meet the mold for those matches. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the custom services, which are essentially the bread and butter of your matchmaker and what makes it unique. So you'll likely spend most of your time here developing really detailed match functions that will help and ensure your players into getting into competitive matches. So the query service will trigger a match function, which looks for tickets in the pool that meets a particular match profile. Well, I will say meet any match profile. And the reason why I say meet any match profile is because a ticket can satisfy requirements for multiple match profiles, which is ideal because if you want to shorten queue times for players, you want them to be considered for the most matches possible. So the question is, how do you determine which match is the best match for a ticket or a player or a match? This is where the evaluator comes in. So the evaluator will look at these proposed matches and determine its quality based on score. So as an example, imagine that your tickets have a queue time when they enter into the queue, and your evaluator will then look at the player skill, ensure that the players are skilled closely together. But the additional logic that your evaluator will add on top of it is if you want to look at these queue times to see how long these players have been stuck in the queue in their 1v1 matches, what happens is it will look at the queue time, take an average of, say, the two players that are going for a 1v1, see what their average queue time is, and that is the score that will put them at the top of the queue in order to be selected for a match. This will ensure that players that are in a fair match that have been in the queue the longest will get priority in being selected first for a game, which is great for keeping your players around. So just to explore the matchmaking workflow of OpenMatch, here is the flow of what you can expect when you submit your request to OpenMatch. Your client will connect to your game front end to submit a request to OpenMatch once it has accessed all the appropriate player information and created and sends that information to satisfy the proto to create that matchmaking ticket. So the ticket finds its way through OpenMatch where it's stored in a state store. OpenMatch uses Redis for this. And along with the other tickets that come in, they're entered into Redis where they will be then looked at in consideration for a match. So your ticket is then filtered into the ticket pool along with the other tickets that meet the criteria for a match. And the match function is then triggered by the query service, which will then create the proposed matches that will await assignment. So now we look at the assignment step and what happens. So for assignment, the director will provide game server addresses which are assigned to the tickets and the backend service. So once these tickets are updated, they're also updated in the state store, and the front end actually listens to the state store to ensure that once they found a ticket that has been assigned, they will send a response or an assignment to the game front end, which ultimately is sent then to the client. So now we're going to look at a demo of how this works. So I'm going to switch over to a Visual Studio Code window. And what we have here is I'm going to spin up I'm going to forward this port. So now we're forwarding. What I'm going to do initially is I'm forwarding all the traffic from the game front end back to the client so that we can see what's happening, the game front end. And this will represent and show how clients will submit tickets as well as how the director looks at these tickets in consideration for matches. So I will walk you through how the updated responses in this demo are going to show you exactly the life cycle of a ticket. So the first thing we're going to explore is the fact that you're going to connect to your game front end. So once you've connected to your game front end via gRPC, then what you're going to do is you're going to create a matchmaking request or create an open match ticket. So for this demo, it is a 1v1 match between two players or two tickets. There are no skill level requirements, so it is a completely blank ticket. So that is what you see here in this step, where we're creating a ticket with no attributes, no skill level, no latency, anything. All right. So let's look at what the match criteria or the match profile is going to look like. And your tickets will then be placed into ticket pools based upon this profile. So let's scroll up, and here you will see that you're creating a match profile, and it is a 1v1 profile that is named everyone. Reason this, you just gave this ticket pool a name, and as you can see here, this is the ticket pool. You're going to create a ticket pool and name it everyone, where all tickets are going to be considered for a 1v1 match, because in this example, there's nothing that separates the tickets from one another, like skill or latency or queue time. This director is where the match profile is being created. And in order to make sure that we create and assign tickets, assign servers to these match profiles, what you're going to do is you're going to have to dial into the game backend. So that was the first step that I overstepped, but you're dialing into the backend via gRPC. And once you've connected, you'll create your match profile. You'll create the pools of tickets that fit this match profile. And then these ticket pools will be looked at by your match function service. So we'll explore what that looks like. So just to show you what's going to happen in the director, once the matches have been found, or once there is a array of proposed matches, what's going to happen is here we're going to create an assignment ticket request. And here, this is where you'll update the assignment for your ticket. You're going to give it a random IP address. So that's all this is doing. But what's going to happen is, since we've dialed into this backend, we're going to make sure that we assign the tickets via the backend. So let's go back to our match function, where we can look at what the match function does. So the match function is going to then create an object for the tickets to actually work with. You're going to create a map that is going to hold the ticket ID, which helps it be accessed quicker based upon this key. And the value is just going to be the value of the ticket. Here, we're going to go through the tickets, and we're going to select the first two tickets inside of this ticket pool. Since there's no skill requirements, we're just going to select two players and just throw them into a match. And when we do this, we're going to create this proposed match right here. And the way we do that is we provide a match ID, the match profile, so we give it a name, and we provide the match function that executed and created this match, as well as the tickets that satisfy this match and are being considered for this match. Open match ships with a default evaluator, and you can create your own custom evaluator. But for this example, we use the default because we're not really doing much, and we just want to make sure that the players just get considered for all matches. So the default evaluator will just take all of the matches and just push them through by default. Now, the good thing about this is you can extend the default evaluator as needed in a basic setting, and we provide documentation and tutorials on that. So I will provide you with those resources toward the end of the presentation. So now that we've spun up our actual, we spun up this demo, and we are forwarding all of the traffic to a web browser that's going to simulate the game front end, I'm going to switch over to a demo, and we are going to reload this page. And here in the demo, what you can see, what you're looking at is you're looking at a list of clients that represent fake players, and they're submitting matchmaking requests. So it's happening very quickly, but you can see some of the fake players are at the main menu, and then they're eventually going to submit a request to be placed in a match. So then you'll see the message that says awaiting or waiting for a ticket assignment. And if you look lower at the bottom, you see your director, and your director is sleeping, but the director, once it's considering tickets for matches, will then create these match profiles. The backend service will then query and the backend service will then assign the tickets because of the query service firing off the match function. And here you'll see the actual time that it takes to create this match and assign it via the director, as well as how long it takes and which tickets were assigned to this particular match. So there you have the full life cycle of the actual ticket that we showed via the graphics that I showed. So let's go back to our presentation. I'm going to close off this, and we're going to round third base and bring it home. So as a summary of everything that was discussed today, OpenMatch provides the core features of a matchmaker and also allows you to customize components that allow to make the matchmaker your own. So you get to spend a lot more time on your matchmaking logic and a lot less time worrying about whether your matchmaker will be able to handle a big surge of players. And that's provided to you by the features of Kubernetes, which provide horizontal and even vertical scaling if you needed to, and the extensible features that will do things such as load balance and secure network traffic. So OpenMatch grows with the need of your game. And not to sound like a caveman, but open source good. It takes a village to raise a child. That saying's been thrown around quite a bit, and OpenMatch is as good as it is because a lot of developers and studios and publishers have come together to determine what are the core functionalities that a matchmaker needs and provides that as a framework so that most developers can spend less time building this matchmaker from scratch and just worry about connecting players together. So those resources that I mentioned before, if you would like to explore OpenMatch, please check out openmatch.dev. There you'll find documentation, tutorials, samples, and links to join the OpenMatch Slack, as well as the OpenMatch GitHub repo. And we host a monthly OpenMatch community meeting. If you want to look at what other solutions Google is working on, you can check out the solutions page, and that's cloud.google.com/solutions /gaming, where we have a bunch of open source as well as managed services. And if you are new to Kubernetes, I suggest you encourage you to check out kubernetes.io. It provides a base level introduction as well as some detailed instruction on how to use Kubernetes and all of the features and terminology that you need to know. And it's a great first step before you start to explore OpenMatch, which obviously runs with Kubernetes. So I would like to thank you for joining me for this talk. If you would like to talk gaming, talk matchmaking, anything.
Thank you, John. Can't believe that. With John finished, that brings us to our last speaker of this conference, who has joined Nanobit in 2019 as a DevOps engineer and has been responsible for maintaining the backend architecture for all published mobile games. They feel very lucky to be able to combine both their private life with their love of gaming with their professional life. Let's listen in to Nenad Virkic.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for being here with us today. My name is Nenad Virkic and I am working as a DevOps engineer at Nanobit. In this talk, I will try to point out main benefits of backend services in mobile game development and why everyone, at least at some point, should utilize backend in their environments. Here is the agenda and all the topics that I will cover through this talk. I'm going to say a few words about us, who we are, what we do, and how do we started with mobile game development. I will try to explain how we utilize backend services in our environment, and I'm going to introduce NGS backend solution along with its main components, such as web servers, queue, workers, and storage. As I mentioned, I'm from Nanobit, and Nanobit is a mobile game development studio from Zagreb. It was founded 10 years ago by two developers, Alan Sumina and Zoran Vucinic. Funny thing is that Nanobit actually started with application development for relatively new iOS platform back in the days. And constant growth of the company later led to mobile game development. The first mobile game title was published back in 2011, and until today, Nanobit has successfully released over 30 titles. Right now, we are counting over 130 million downloads from both application stores, Google Play Store and Apple App Store. And we have over 4 million active players. Another interesting thing is that we are completely in charge of the product, meaning that we are creating a game from scratch. We are creating a game idea, we are creating game design, we are developing the game, and finally we are publishing game on the market. So, why you should use backend in mobile game development? Well, the main purpose of our backend is to provide support to all client devices. With various backend services, we are able to increase application performance and user experience. We shifted most of the game logic to the server side, and on that way we achieved much greater consistency level and better validation of all user actions. Also, with the NGS backend, we are able to collect the data, which helps us with making proper decisions when it comes to releasing new features or new game items. The last one, but I can say the most important one, is definitely to prevent cheating. And we are able to do that with much better validation of user actions and greater control of all in-app purchase transactions. And here, on the following image, you can see the high level of the NGS architecture. NGS stands for Nanobit Game Server, and this particular architecture supports all our games we have published so far. For better understanding, we can divide the architecture into 4 layers, and we have web server layer, queue layer, worker layer, and finally storage layer. When a client starts the game, that triggers an HTTP request. Each request has to go through every component in the architecture to be successfully processed. Once the request was processed, the response was sent back to the client device. We can look at the web servers as the entry point for the NGS architecture. Web servers are responsible for each HTTP request received from client. When game is started, the client opens a permanent HTTP WebSocket connection with web server layer. Every game or user action is actually one request to web servers, which is later being forwarded to the queue layer. Once the request was processed by all architecture layers, web servers send the response back to client device. Web servers are in-house piece of software. They are written in Python, and we are running them as a Docker containers on top of AWS EC2 instance. AWS EC2 instance is basically a Linux virtual machine in Amazon cloud environment. The second component in NGS architecture is queue. We can describe queue as a service that routes messages between web servers and workers. Queue accepts all requests from web servers, and based on request parameters such as game version and user ID, it forwards the message to the appropriate worker. Queue keeps track of all active workers, and it can handle adding new workers to the communication chain or removing existing ones from it. Queue is also a custom piece of software, and it was written in Golang, which is very fast and responsive programming language. Just like web servers, we are running it as a Dockerized service on top of EC2 instance. For workers, we like to say they are the brain of the NGS architecture, and they are the main part of it. Workers process requests received from the queue, and each worker handles requests for one specific game and game version only. Once they process request, a response message was sent back to web server layer. Besides processing requests received from web servers, workers also handle sending push notification to client devices. And they take care about users' save game data, meaning that they are storing new save game data to a database, or they can send existing save game data back to client device. We are running them as a Dockerized Python service, and we can easily scale them up or scale them down based on the current load at the specific moment. At storage level, we are using three types of databases. The first one is RIAC. RIAC is a NoSQL database, and we are running it as a cluster. The cluster was configured on top of several AWS EC2 servers, and its main purpose is to store users' save game data. At this moment, we are migrating from RIAC to Apache Cassandra, which we found more suitable for us. The second one is Elasticache Redis, which we are using as a cache memory. Elasticache Redis holds the data that has to be quickly accessible and available at all times. Some of the values that we store into Elasticache Redis are various game settings, device IDs, player leaderboards, or in-app purchase subscriptions. The last one is RDS. RDS is actually a relational-based database in which we store the data related to legacy games. It was used as the main database in the past, but we couldn't scale it up enough so it can handle the load for all new games and all new users. So we decided to keep it alive so it could support legacy games only. For conclusion, I would like to point out three main benefits of using backend architecture in Nanobit's game development process. With backend services, we have improved gaming experience and we increased application performance. When it comes to releasing new features to the game or even new game items, we have a much better perspective which feature we should release and which feature we shouldn't. And we are able to do that with all the data we have collected from client devices. And finally, we have ability to prevent cheating with greater validation of all user actions and better control of in-app purchases. Thank you very much for your attention, and once again, thank you very much for being here with us today. That's all from me for this talk. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I will try to answer it. And if you have any additional questions, you can contact me on social media or you can find me on LinkedIn or contact me via email. Thank you very much and see you. Bye.
Thank you, Nenad. And with that, that brings us to the end of another Shift Remote. I would love to say thank you for joining us, for your enthusiasm that I hope was there, for the energy that I'm sure you brought wherever you are in the world. And without further ado, just want to say a huge thank you to our own team at Shift Conference, but also another huge thank you to our partners and supporters at Microsoft, Infobip, Raiffeisen Bank, Autodesk, Microblink, Barrage, Azure Idea, ICT Japania, Venture, Pseudocode, 5, Ars Futura, Nanobit, Infinuum, and Q. Then 9 Dots, Get by Bus, Aspira, Code Anywhere, and Pluggy. Without you, none of this would have been possible. Also, a huge thank you once again to you, wherever you are in the world. Please do find out more about our upcoming events there on our website, where all the information is there. And please do post things on social media. Give us a wave. Let us know how you felt. But without further ado, all that's left to say from myself and the team at Shift is goodbye.